20 years ago, one man walked into the mountains, leaving behind his land, his friends, and his enemies. Everyone thought he was dead, but one day he came back to find his home claimed by strangers. The town had changed, and the new owners didn't even know his name. He came for what was his, and that was just the start of a war where truth cut sharper than a bullet. Stick around to discover how one man can challenge an entire town and what lies behind his fight for justice. Hey, listener, how's it going? Where are you tuning in from today? The sun hung low over the jagged peaks, casting long shadows across the dusty trail where Elias Kane rode into Willow Creek. His face, carved with lines from 20 years of mountain winds, stayed hard as stone, his eyes fixed on the town below. The old horse beneath him, a gray mare named Sable, stepped slow and steady, her hooves kicking up clouds of dry earth. Elias hadn't seen these streets in 2 decades, but the place felt wrong now. Too many new buildings, too much noise from the saloon spilling into the evening air. Once, this was his home. Now, it looked at him like a stranger. He tied Sable to a post outside the Rusty Spur, the only saloon still standing from his time. Inside, the air smelled of stale whiskey and sweat. Men hunched over tables, their laughter dying as Elias stepped through the swinging doors. His boots thudded on the warped floorboards, each step drawing eyes. The bartender, a wiry man with a patchy beard, squinted at him, trying to place the face under the weathered hat. Elias didn't care. He wasn't here for welcomes. At the bar, he leaned forward, his voice low but clear. "Who owns the old Kane Ranch now?" The question hung in the air like smoke. A few men chuckled, thinking it a joke, but the bartender's face tightened. "That'd be Mr. Hargrove, the banker," he said, wiping a glass with a rag that looked older than the town. "Been his for years. You got business with him?" Elias didn't answer, just stared until the bartender looked away. Outside, the town kept moving. Wagons creaked, women hurried past with baskets, and a kid stared at Elias like he was a ghost. Maybe he was. 20 years in the mountains could make a man half dead, but Elias felt alive enough to know one thing. This place had forgotten him, but he hadn't forgotten it. His ranch, his sweat, his blood. It was still out there, just beyond the ridge, and he'd come to take it back, no matter what stood in his way. Elias Kane stood at the bar of the Rusty Spur, his hands resting on the counter, fingers calloused from years of gripping reins and axes. The saloon's chatter had gone quiet, replaced by the clink of glasses and the shuffle of boots as men leaned closer to hear. He'd asked about his ranch, and the bartender's answer, that it belonged to Hargrove, landed like a stone in his gut. Now, a man with a crooked nose and a fancy vest piped up from a card table. "You talking about that patch of dirt out by the ridge? Hargrove's had it for nigh on 15 years. What's it to you, stranger?" Elias turned slow, his gaze locking onto the man. "That dirt," he said, voice steady as a drawn bow, "was mine before Hargrove ever set foot in this town. I built the house, dug the well, broke the land." The words weren't loud, but they carried weight, like a storm cloud rolling over the plains. The card players exchanged glances, some smirking, others uneasy. A big man in a red shirt laughed, slapping the table. "Mister, land ain't held by stories. You got papers." Before Elias could answer, the saloon doors swung open, and Sheriff Amos Tate stepped in, his badge glinting under the lamplight. He was a stocky man, gray at the temples, with eyes that darted too quick for comfort. "What's the trouble here?" he asked, his hand resting near his holster. The bartender nodded toward Elias. "This fella's asking about the Kane Ranch, Sheriff." Says it's his Tate's brow furrowed, and he studied Elias like he was sizing up a rattlesnake. "That so? Well, friend, things work different now. Hargrove's got deeds, signed and sealed. You got proof, or you just stirring up dust?" Elias straightened, his shadow stretching long across the floor. "Land don't forget its owner," he said, each word sharp as a knife's edge. "I don't need paper to know what's mine." The room went still, the kind of quiet that comes before a fight. Tate's jaw tightened, but he didn't draw. Instead, he stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You want to talk claims? Take it to Hargrove. But don't go making waves in my town." Elias held the sheriff's gaze, then nodded once, turning for the door. As he stepped outside, the saloon erupted in whispers. He didn't need to hear them to know one thing. This fight was just beginning. The news of Elias Kane's return spread through Willow Creek like wildfire through dry grass. By morning, the town buzzed with talk, from the general store to the church steps. Folks gathered in knots, their voices low, swapping stories about the stranger who'd walked out of the mountains, claiming a ranch long gone. Some called him a madman, a ghost chasing shadows of a life nobody remembered. Others, mostly the older ones, squinted into the distance, muttering about a man who'd once stood against outlaws and won. In the barber shop, old man Cutler, his hands shaky with a razor, told anyone who'd listen that Elias was trouble. "He's got that look," Cutler said, snipping at a customer's hair, "like a wolf who's been hungry too long. Mark my words, he'll bring blood across the street." At the Mercantile, Widow Hayes wasn't so sure. She'd seen Elias ride in, his face hard but his eyes carrying something deeper, like a man who'd lost more than land. "He ain't crazy," she told a group of women sorting cloth. "He's got a right to ask questions." That ranch was his, before Hargrove came with his fancy suits. At Hargrove's bank, the man himself sat behind a polished desk, flipping through papers that proved his claim to the Kane Ranch. His assistant, a nervous young man named Willis, stood by clutching a ledger. "It's all legal, sir," Willis said, his voice unsteady. "Deeds filed, taxes paid." "He can't touch it." Hargrove, a stout man with a mustache waxed to points, leaned back in his chair. "Legal don't mean safe," he said, tapping the desk. "This Kane fella's got the town talking." "That's a problem." He sent Willis to fetch Sheriff Tate, who arrived sweating, despite the cool morning. Tate tried to sound confident. "I told him to take it up with you, mister." Hargrove offered to settle it peaceful-like, but his eyes betrayed him, flickering with doubt. Elias's words in the saloon, about the land remembering its owner, had stuck like a burr. By noon, the town's mood had shifted. Some folks whispered that Elias was a fool, stirring up trouble he couldn't win. Others wondered if Hargrove's papers told the whole story. At the saloon, a drunk ranch hand spat on the floor, saying, "Let him try. Hargrove will bury him." But across the bar, an old-timer nursing a whiskey shook his head. "You didn't see his eyes," he muttered. "That man ain't here to lose." Elias Kane didn't ride back to the mountains. Instead, he staked out a spot just beyond the ridge, where the land dipped into a shallow valley, and his old ranch house stood in the distance, its weathered boards glowing under the setting sun. He built a small camp there, nothing fancy. A fire pit, a lean-to for Sable, and a bedroll under the stars. Each night, he sat by the flames, his eyes fixed on the lights flickering in what used to be his home. Hargrove's men rode past now and then, their horses kicking up dust, but Elias didn't flinch. He was staying, and they knew it. One evening, as the sky turned purple, 3 men rode up, their spurs jingling like a warning. They were Hargrove's hands, rough types with pistols slung low. The leader, a broad-shouldered man named Tucker, leaned forward in his saddle, his voice thick with menace. "You're on private land, old man." Mr. Hargrove don't take kindly to squatters. Elias stood slow, his rifle resting easy in his hands, the barrel catching the firelight. "This ain't his land," he said, calm as a still pond. "It's mine." "Always was," Tucker laughed, but it was forced, and his men shifted in their saddles, hands twitching near their guns. Elias didn't move, just kept his eyes on Tucker's. "You got a message to deliver. I'm listening," he said. "But if you're here to scare me, you're wasting your breath." The men exchanged looks, unsure. Tucker spat into the dirt. "Hargrove wants you gone by morning. Next time, we won't be talking." They wheeled their horses and rode off, leaving Elias alone with the crackle of his fire. He didn't sleep that night, not out of fear, but because he was thinking. The land under his feet held memories. His wife's laughter, the sweat of building the barn, the quiet nights before it all went wrong. He wasn't leaving. By morning, word of the standoff reached town. Folks at the saloon whispered about the mountain man who wouldn't budge, even with Hargrove's muscle breathing down his neck. A few ranchers, hardened by their own fights with the bank, nodded quietly, impressed. Elias wasn't just a ghost from the past. He was a man planting his flag, daring the world to move him. And in Willow Creek, where money talked louder than truth, that kind of stubbornness was starting to turn heads. The morning mist clung to the valley as Elias Kane sat by his fire, sharpening a knife with slow, deliberate strokes. His camp was quiet, save for the soft snorting of Sable tethered nearby. He'd been expecting trouble since Tucker's visit, but the hoofbeats approaching now carried a different rhythm, hesitant, almost reluctant. Elias looked up to see a lone rider, an older man with a slouched hat and a face etched with regret. It was Caleb Morse, the friend who'd helped him build the ranch all those years ago, back when life seemed simpler. Caleb dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravelly earth. "Elias," he said, voice rough like he'd swallowed sand. "Didn't think I'd ever see you again." Elias set the knife down, his eyes narrowing but not cold. "Thought you'd be in a saloon by now, Caleb, not out here in the dirt." The words weren't cruel, but they cut. Caleb winced, rubbing the back of his neck. "I sold it, Elias." "The ranch. After you left, we all thought you were dead." Hargrove came sniffing, offered good money. "I took it." He paused, waiting for anger, but Elias just stared, his silence heavier than any shout. "I didn't know you'd come back," Caleb went on, his voice breaking. "I had debts, a family to feed. It wasn't betrayal, not how I saw it then." Elias stood, brushing dust from his hands, and walked to the edge of the camp, looking out at the ranch in the distance. "You stood with me when we fought off rustlers," he said finally. "Drank with me when my Sarah passed. And you sold her home without a word." Caleb's shoulders sagged, the weight of 20 years pressing down. "I'm sorry, Elias. I can't undo it." Elias turned, his face unreadable. "Ain't about undoing," he said. "It's about what's right." He picked up his knife again, resuming his work, each scrape of the blade like a clock ticking. Caleb lingered, as if hoping for forgiveness, but Elias offered none. When Caleb finally rode away, the mist swallowed him, leaving Elias alone with the truth. His fight wasn't just with Hargrove or the town, but with the ghosts of men he'd once called brothers. He sheathed the knife and looked to the horizon. The past couldn't be reclaimed, but he'd be damned if he let it be forgotten. Elias Kane's camp became a fixture on the ridge, a stubborn scar on the land Hargrove claimed as his own. Each morning, he rose with the sun, tending to Sable and gathering wood, his movements steady but deliberate, like a man who knew eyes were watching. The townsfolk whispered about him, some calling him a fool, others a hero, but Hargrove wasn't waiting for rumors to settle. He'd had enough of the mountain man's defiance. By week's end, he'd rallied a posse of hired men, their belts heavy with iron, and leaned on Sheriff Tate to look the other way. "Handle it quiet," Hargrove told. Namely, "System. Sorry, it looks like my response got cut off. Here's the continuation." "Keep things legal," he told Tate, his voice smooth but sharp. "I don't want a war in my town." Elias, meanwhile, kept to his work. He mended a broken fence near his camp, not because it was his, but because it needed doing. One afternoon, he hauled a neighbor's horse from a muddy creek bed, his arms straining as he pulled the animal free. The rancher, a wiry man named Dobbs, offered him a meal in thanks, but Elias just nodded and walked away. Word of these acts spread, and the town's mood began to shift. At the general store, a woman buying flour said, "He ain't like Hargrove's men, roughing folks up for late payments." A blacksmith agreed, muttering, "Kane's got honor. More'n most round here." Hargrove caught wind of this and doubled down. He sent Tucker and his crew to burn Elias's camp, but they found it empty, the fire cold. Elias had moved higher into the hills, leaving only a pile of rocks arranged in a way that felt like a taunt. Tucker kicked them over, cursing, but his men were uneasy. "He's like a damn ghost," one muttered, scanning the trees. That night, Hargrove met with Tate in his office, slamming a fist on the desk. "You're the law, Amos. Run him out." Tate, sweating, promised to act, but his hands shook as he poured a drink. He'd seen Elias's eyes, and he knew no amount of money could tame a man like that. Elias didn't seek fights, but he didn't run from them either. He helped a widow fix her leaky roof, his hammer steady as he worked in silence. When a kid fell into a well, Elias was the first to climb down, hauling the boy up without a word. These weren't grand gestures, just things that needed doing, but each one chipped away at Hargrove's grip on the town. By the time the week ended, folks at the Rusty Spur weren't just talking about Elias's claim. They were starting to root for him. The Rusty Spur was packed that evening, the air thick with tobacco smoke and the hum of restless voices. Sheriff Tate had called a meeting, his boots heavy on the floorboards, as he stood at the center, trying to look taller than he felt. Hargrove sat at a corner table, his suit crisp, his eyes cold as he watched the crowd. Elias Kane stood near the back, arms crossed, his hat low, but his presence impossible to ignore. The saloon had become a battleground, not for bullets, but for words that could spark them. Tate cleared his throat, holding up a hand for quiet. "Folks, we got a problem," he said, his voice unsteady. "This man claims the Kane Ranch, says it's his by right. Mr. Hargrove here has papers, legal and proper. We need to settle this before it gets ugly." Hargrove stood, smoothing his vest. "This ain't about claims," he said, pointing at Elias. "This man's been threatening my property, stirring up trouble. I want him gone, or I'll see him in jail." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some nodding, others frowning. Elias stepped forward, his boots deliberate, and the room hushed. He reached into his coat and pulled out a rusted key, its edges worn but unmistakable, and set it on the bar with a heavy clunk. "This opened the barn I built," he said, his voice low but carrying to every corner. "I forged it myself, 22 years ago. You tell me, Hargrove, where's your key?" The crowd shifted, eyes darting between the key and Hargrove, who scoffed but looked rattled. "Keys don't prove ownership," he snapped. "Deeds do." A woman in the crowd, Widow Hayes, spoke up, her voice sharp. "I remember Elias working that land, sunup to sundown." "Where were you then, Hargrove?" A few others nodded, old-timers mostly, their memories stirring. Hargrove's face reddened, but he held his ground. "This is a court matter, not a saloon brawl," he said. Tate nodded, eager to end it. "Take it to a judge, Kane." "That's the law." Elias didn't move, his eyes locked on Hargrove. "Law don't erase what's true," he said. The room felt like a powder keg, one spark away from exploding. The saloon doors swung shut behind Elias Kane, but the weight of his words lingered like dust in the air. The crowd inside the Rusty Spur broke into factions, their voices rising in a chaotic hum. Some backed Hargrove, their loyalty tied to his money and the jobs he controlled. "He's got the deeds," a young ranch hand said, slamming his glass down. "What's a key against paper?" Others, especially the older folks, weren't so sure. An old rancher named Pritchard leaned against the bar, his voice gravelly as he spoke. "I was there when Elias fought off bandits to save this town. Hargrove was still selling pens in Boston then. Outside, the streets of Willow Creek carried the argument like a fever. At the general store, women sorting beans debated whether Elias was a hero or a troublemaker. "He's stirring up ghosts," one said, shaking her head. But Widow Hayes, clutching her shawl, countered, "Maybe this town needs its ghosts woken up." The blacksmith, wiping sweat from his brow, told his apprentice about the old days, when Elias and his wife Sarah were the heart of the valley. "He didn't just own that land," he said. "He was that land." Hargrove, back in his bank, paced behind his desk, his usual calm fraying. His assistant Willis stood nervously, clutching a stack of papers. "They're listening to him, sir," Willis said. "Folks are talking like he's got a claim." Hargrove's fist hit the desk, rattling an inkwell. "He's got nothing but stories and a damn key," he snapped. But his eyes betrayed worry. He'd built his empire on control, but Elias was cracking the foundation not with guns, but with memory. Sheriff Tate felt the pressure most. He sat in his office, staring at his badge, wondering how he'd ended up as Hargrove's errand boy. He'd seen the look in Elias's eyes, not wild but certain, like a man who'd already lost everything and had nothing left to fear. By evening, the town's air was thick with tension, every glance and whisper charged. Some wanted Elias gone, others wanted him to stay, but all knew one thing. Willow Creek was waking up to its past, and it wasn't going to sleep easy again. Elias Kane vanished into the hills before dawn, his camp left bare except for a circle of stones where his fire had burned. Hargrove, fed up with the town's whispers, hired a crew of 6 hard men, led by Tucker, to hunt him down. "Find him, scare him, or bury him," Hargrove had said, his voice tight with anger. The men rode out with rifles slung across their backs, their horses' hooves pounding the earth. They figured Elias was just one man, easy to break. They didn't know the mountains like he did. Elias moved through the high country like a shadow, his steps silent on paths he'd walked for 20 years. He knew every ridge, every hidden spring, every narrow pass where a man could disappear. When Tucker's crew reached the valley, they found nothing but Sable's hoofprints leading into a rocky canyon. Tucker cursed, spitting into the dirt. "Spread out," he ordered, but his men hesitated, their eyes scanning the cliffs above. The air felt heavy, like the mountains were watching. Elias was somewhere close, and they could feel it. By midday, the hunters were rattled. One man's horse shied when a rock slid down a slope, kicked loose by Elias from a ledge above. Another swore he saw movement in the pines, but found only wind. That night, as they camped, Elias struck. He slipped into their camp, silent as fog, and cut their saddlebags loose, scattering their supplies. By morning, they woke to find their fire doused and a single bullet placed on a rock, gleaming in the sun. "He's playing with us," one man muttered, his voice shaking. Tucker kicked the bullet into the dirt, but even he looked spooked. Word of the chase reached Willow Creek, where folks gathered at the saloon piecing together the story. "He's outsmarting him," the blacksmith said, a grin tugging at his lips. Widow Hayes nodded, her eyes sharp. "Those mountains are his. Hargrove's men are fools to think they'll win." The town was splitting further, some cheering Elias's defiance, others cursing him for stirring trouble. But no one could deny it. He wasn't just fighting Hargrove. He was fighting like the land itself, using every trick the mountains had taught him. The sun was dipping behind the peaks when Hargrove decided he'd had enough of games. He rode out to the edge of town, his black coat flapping, and called for Elias to face him. "No more hiding," he shouted into the hills, his voice echoing off the rocks. Tucker and his men, bruised and rattled from days of chasing shadows, stood behind him, their rifles ready, but their faces grim. Word spread fast, and by dusk, a small crowd had gathered near the old oak at the town's edge, waiting to see if the mountain man would show. Elias emerged from the pines, Sable trailing behind him, her reins loose in his hand. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with something that made the crowd step back. He stopped 20 paces from Hargrove, his rifle slung over his shoulder, hands empty but steady. "You wanted me," Elias said, his voice cutting through the evening air. "Here I am." Hargrove straightened, his mustache twitching. "This ends now, Kane. Your stories don't change facts. I own that land, bought and paid for. Money talks louder than your memories." Elias tilted his head, his gaze never leaving Hargrove's. "Money buys paper," he said, "but blood and sweat buy something else. That land knows me. You're just passing through." The crowd murmured, some nodding, others shifting uneasily. Hargrove's face darkened, and he stepped closer, his voice low but venomous. "You're a relic, Kane. This world don't need men like you no more. Walk away, or I'll bury you." Elias didn't flinch. "You can try," he said, "but the land chooses its own." Sheriff Tate pushed through the crowd, his hands raised. "Enough," he barked, sweat beading on his forehead. "This ain't a duel. Take it to court, or I'll lock you both up." But his words felt hollow, and the crowd's eyes stayed on Elias and Hargrove, 2 men standing like opposing storms. The air crackled with tension, not from guns, but from the clash of their worlds. One built on roots, the other on greed. The townsfolk saw it clear now. This wasn't just about a ranch. It was about what Willow Creek stood for. The night settled over the Kane Ranch like a heavy blanket, the stars hidden by clouds rolling in from the mountains. Elias stood alone in front of the old house, his silhouette sharp against the glow of lanterns held by the crowd gathered in a loose semicircle. Hargrove stood opposite, flanked by Tucker and 2 of his men, their hands restless near their holsters. Sheriff Tate hovered nearby, his badge catching the light, his face pale as he tried to keep order. The townsfolk, ranchers, shopkeepers, widows, watched in silence, Their breath held as if the land itself was waiting for judgment. Elias's voice broke the quiet, steady and deep. "This house," he said, pointing to the weathered boards behind him, "I built with my hands." My wife's laughter filled it. My sweat soaked its fields. "You can have your papers, Hargrove, but this land ain't yours." Hargrove sneered, stepping forward, his voice sharp with contempt. "You're a fool, Kane. This town's moved on. You're nothing but a ghost clinging to dirt." The crowd stirred, some muttering agreement, others shaking their heads, their eyes fixed on Elias. Tate raised his hands, desperate to stop what was coming. "This ain't the way," he said, his voice cracking. "We got laws for this. Go to a judge." But Elias didn't look at him. His eyes stayed on Hargrove, unyielding. "Law don't speak for the land," he said. "It speaks for men like you who think they can buy a man's life." A woman in the crowd, Widow Hayes, called out, "He's right." That ranch was his before any of us knew Hargrove. A few others nodded, their voices rising, but Tucker's men shifted, hands tightening on their guns. The tension snapped like a taut rope when Hargrove stepped closer, his face inches from Elias's. "You want this land," he hissed. "Take it. But you'll leave in a box." Elias didn't move, his voice low but clear. "I ain't leaving. This is my life. You want to take it, try." The crowd went silent, the air so thick it felt like breathing stone. No one drew, but every eye knew this moment wasn't about guns. It was about who Willow Creek would choose to follow, a man of paper or a man of the earth. The standoff at the Kane Ranch ended not with gunfire, but with a quiet that felt louder than any shot. Elias stood firm, his eyes locked on Hargrove, while the crowd's murmurs grew into a chorus. Widow Hayes stepped forward, her voice cutting through the night. "I remember Elias saving my boy from a flood 20 years back. Who's Hargrove saved?" Old Pritchard, leaning on his cane, added, "Kane fought for this town when bandits came." "Where was your money then, Hargrove?" One by one, voices rose, not shouting, but steady, like a river carving stone. Hargrove's face twisted, his confidence cracking. He turned to Tucker, but his men looked away, their hands no longer itching for their guns. Sheriff Tate, caught in the middle, finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "This ain't about papers no more. It's about what's right." He looked at Hargrove, then at Elias, and stepped back, his badge suddenly heavy. Hargrove opened his mouth to argue, but the crowd's eyes were on Elias, and he knew he'd lost. "You'll regret this," he spat, then turned and walked away, his men trailing like shadows. By morning, the town had made its choice. No judge was called, no court convened. Hargrove's deeds were real, but the people's will was stronger. They gave Elias his ranch back, not with paper, but with their hands, helping him mend the fences, clean the barn, and rebuild what time had worn down. Elias worked alongside them, silent but grateful, his hand steady as he drove nails into wood. The land felt alive again, as if it had been waiting for him. Weeks later, Elias sat on the porch of his old house, Sable grazing nearby. The town was quieter now. Hargrove's grip loosened, his bank less a throne. Some folks still grumbled, loyal to money, but most saw what Elias had done, not just reclaimed his home, but reminded them who they were. As the sun dipped low, painting the valley gold, Elias carved a small wooden cross and set it by the oak tree, where Sarah's memory lingered. He didn't speak, but his eyes said enough. This was home, and he'd never leave again. And so, Willow Creek learned that sometimes one man's fight could bring back a town's soul. That's how it was.